Okay, I think we can make a start. Good evening, and thank you for joining. We are. I want to go through with you just really something that sets the tone for the whole of the first parsha of Vayishlach. Unusually, I think it's unusual. I haven't done a survey, but I think unusually the Ramban has a short introduction to the parsha. He says Nichtava Parsha Hazos. The very beginning of the parsha in the Ramban. He says Nichtava Parsha Hazos. He says the reason why this parsha was written was for the following reason. Now that alone is a really striking way of saying it in a sense. The Ramban is almost seems as if the Ramban has to justify and explain Parshas Vayishlach, the whole of the episode of the encounter between Yaakov and Esau. He says Nichtava Parsha Hazos L'odia to tell us Ki hitzel HaKadosh Baruch Hu es avdoi, that Hashem saves his servant, the golem yad chazak mimenu, and redeems him from one stronger than him. The Yishlach Malach v'yatzileu, he sends an angel, he sends a Malach v'yatzileu and saves him. Ulelamdeinu oid, and to teach us beyond that, the following. Shehu lo botach b'tzidkoso. The Yaakov didn't rely on his own righteousness. V'hishtadel b'hatzola b'chol yocholta, and he tried to work towards the salvation through his own ability. He worked very hard at it himself. V'yesh ba'od remez l'doros. There's another very important message here for future generations. Because everything that happened to our forefather with his brother Esau, will have the same relationship, the same ongoing relationship with his descendants. And it's appropriate for us to take hold, to learn from, to understand the ways of our ancestor Yaakov, the righteous one. So that whenever this encounter replays itself, as it will, we will always prepare in the same way. L'tfilah, for prayer, l'doron, for a gift, and for salvation through waging war if necessary, to run away and to be saved thereby. Now, as I said, the Ramban here, first he seems to find it necessary to set the tone for the whole parsha. But more significantly, he says that there is the immediate lessons that we learn from this parsha in terms of how Hashem saved Yaakov Avinu. But more significantly even, is the fact that this encounter between Yaakov and Esau is a model. It's an archetype for what will happen thereafter. That encounter, that actual encounter between Yaakov and Esau, we have to learn this parsha on two levels. We have to learn it as the actual encounter between Yaakov and Esau, of course, as what we would call the straightforward pshat, understand the psukim, what happened. But we have to learn also the way to learn the parsha, the Ramban is saying, is as a lesson for us in terms of every time subsequently the encounter replays itself between us and Esau. And what that means really is that this entire parsha is, as I say, when I say the entire parsha, I mean the first section of the parsha until Yaakov moves on, until we have the story of Shechem, is really the complicated and often tragic relationship we have sadly historically had with interactions for those who would seek to do us harm. That's what it is throughout our long history. This is the model for it. And if that's the case, of course, if we want to understand elements of both the roots of what we refer to as anti-Semitism, and also the way and the methods in which we can cope with those struggles that we face, the key, the code, the Ramban is saying, is within Parshas Vayishlach. That's how I'm understanding what the Ramban is saying. And I'd like to share with you a few ideas of how this plays itself out. In terms of the broader picture, we have the episode of Yaakov wrestling with the Malach, wrestling with the angel. As we mentioned before, it's one of the other night, it is one of the hardest parashas to understand in the whole Torah. What is it? How does it fit in? It's a mystical encounter. How are we to understand it? Rav Soloveitchik in the Chumash Maseres Harav, he says that one way of understanding this whole parasha is that it effectively is the representation of the struggle and the battle against anti-Semitism. There are elements of that battle that are present in this parsha. He goes so far as to call Vayishlach the book of the destiny of the Jew. He says that Yaakov's attacked for no apparent reason. Yaakov doesn't know why he's attacked.
What is his
Parsha Shiur.
when Yaakov asks his attacker for his name, he says, I cannot express my identity. That's what he says. Yeah. In Perek Lamed Beis Posuk, I think it's Posuk, where is it? Posuk Beis? No? Yes, Perek Lamed Beis Posuk, Perek Lamed Beis Posuk Lamed, Vayishlach Yaakov Yom Agidon Lo Shmecha, tell me your name. Vayomer said, Lo mazeh tishal shmi. Why is it you're asking my name? He refuses to give him his name. Why? Because that's one of the most horrible characteristics of those who seek to do us harm, of the anti-Semitic problem, that we never know who's going to attack us. He puts it like this, he says, the turn of the century, he says, the socialist literature claimed that anti-Semitism was a result of capitalism. And if you dealt with capitalism, the same would hold true, the same would hold true for anti-Semitism that we dealt with. And then he says, but the socialists rose to power, and immediately they became the most virulent anti-Semites. And this is how it is. We know this. It metamorphoses into more and more situations and scenarios that we could never have predicted. There is no way to tie it down to the left wing, the right wing. It is present, and that is why the Malach cannot give his name. Furthermore, is that you notice, says Rav Soloveitchik, that when Yaakov asks for his name, because he had this uncertain feeling, and he refuses to give it, he doesn't promise Yaakov peace. He doesn't do it. He gives the silence. The silence, he says, implies the permanence of that conflict, that it will continue. It is both the anonymity, he says, the fact that we can't identify where it's coming from specifically, as well as the permanent nature. Effectively, the answer was, he was saying to him, it doesn't make a difference who I am, because whoever I am, I have a mission to oppose you. I oppose you, your values, and what you strive for. That is the encounter between Yaakov and the Malach. So the question is, therefore, what is the response? What is the response? How do we manage? How do we cope? As the Ramban says, we have to learn that from Yaakov as well. If you look at Perek Lamed Beis Posuk Tes, we know that one of the ways in which Yaakov prepares himself, it says, Vayomer Yovei Esav el HaMachaneh HaChas V'Ko. If Esav comes to one machaneh and he smites one camp, V'choyoh HaMachaneh Nishal Lefleita. So the machaneh Nishal, the one which remains, will be Lefleita. They'll be able to flee from there. The Ibn Ezra here has almost a powerful, almost frightening insight. We know that Rashi understands that Rashi says, whether he likes it or not, I'll fight with him. In other words, Rashi understands the other camp being a refuge, salvation, is a safety measure, because he knows at least I will save half. At least I'll be able to save half. That's, they will run away and I will protect them. Says the Ibn Ezra like this. He says, he says, maybe they'll run away. Or maybe the wrath of his brother will calm down when he smites the one camp. Or perhaps they'll be safe from Hashem. But then he goes on to say, he brings a posuk in Shmuel Beis. Then he says, Rashi. Well, Rashi says, he says that is an exposition, it's expounding its drush. But he says, if you look at the simple way of understanding this encounter and Yaakov's methods, Hashem said to him, your descendants will be like dust of the land. He didn't know whether it would be these or whether it would be others. He didn't know whether it would be these descendants. Yaakov was alive when Yosef was sold. He didn't know. Because a Novi doesn't know the hidden things unless Hashem reveals them to him. So the Ibn Ezra is saying something here which is quite frightening. He's saying that the realistic position that Yaakov found himself in wasn't one. When he says, that the Machaneh Nishal, the one the camp that's left over, will be saved, it wasn't a situation where he was saying, I know they'll be saved. He had no idea. He genuinely had no idea. He did not know. The realism, the realistic situation that the Jews have found themselves in so many times is not knowing whether, how, where the salvation will come from. And that was the model Yaakov had as well. The way that Ibn Ezra understands the Pasuk, it makes it, in a sense, even more powerful, the measures he takes, because he doesn't know. He does not know whether this will work at all. But what he does know is that he has to have hope. He has to hope to Hashem that it will work. And as the Ramban says, he has to take the steps. Because if he doesn't take the steps, then He won't have done the necessary hishtadlus, the way he has to conduct himself, the attempts he has to make to save himself. He was deeply, deeply worried. He was deeply worried about this, but nevertheless, he knew that this was the situation he had to do. This was what he had to do. He had to keep going. He had to do his best. That is always, always, and has always been the Jewish way, the Jewish approach, if you like. There is a kliokar as well. So that's if you like the sense of hope that the Jewish people have always used in times of greatest difficulty, the same hope that Yaakov had, even not knowing how things would work out. There's a kliokar in Perek Lamed Beis Posuk Yud Beis, where when Posuk Yud Gimel, Posuk Yud Gimel, that's right. So Yaakov in his tefillah says, I will do good with you, and I will make your descendants like the dust, like the sand of the sea. Will not be counted. There's too many to be counted. Says the Kliyokon. This is really just learning through the key Rishonim, the Ramban, the Ibn Ezra, and the Kliyokon on this parsha, how they understand it and how the way they understand it is a model for us in the re-encounters that we have with Esav. The Kliyokar says, what is it about the sand? Why is it that Yaakov specifically picks out this one of the three? He says, we know that there are three different ways in which the promise is given to the Jewish people, to Avraham Avinu and his descendants, Yitzchak and to Yaakov. Three things. Says the Kliyokar, it's halfway through. He says, they're compared to three things. They're compared to offer, to dust, to earth, l'chol, to sand, and to the stars. And the reason is, he says, just sort of paraphrase it, he says that in the time of peace, tranquility, and success, we're like the stars. No one can come even close to us. We raised above the star. We're raised up in the heavens in the stars. At the time when things are incredibly difficult, we're like offal, we're like dust. We're like everyone treads upon us. And that is also a situation where nevertheless, we still manage to grow. We still manage to become as numerous as the dust, even in those extreme circumstances. But he says there is a middle. Of Izman hamamutza bein shnehem. There are times and periods in our history where we're in between. You could even argue perhaps this is the majority of the time. We're in between the two. There is a time when we don't have any rest from our enemies. They pursue us, they try and destroy us. Hashem saves us from their hands. In those instances, where we have the fear, we have the worry, we have the trepidation, we are being pursued, and yet Hashem saves us, then Hashem compares us to the Choil Hayom, specifically to the sand by the seashore. Nimshalu l'choil zeh, like this sand, he says, shekol galei hayom, all the waves of the sea, omdim lahatzif ha'olam, they sweep away the land, uvahagiyam l'chol, but they reach the sand, him nishborim, they're broken. V'lo yuchlu la'avor es ha'chol. It's impossible to overcome, to break through the sand barrier. The sand will always, always remain. And so too, that is during those moments, as I said, maybe the majority of our history, that's what we've had to bear in mind all the time. The fact that we will come through as a people. Somehow we will come through, like the sand is never completely swept away by the sea. And that's why Yaakov specifically mentions that in his tefillah. To save us, he asks Hashem to save us from his pursuer, from Esau. Just like the sand will never be washed away, so too Esau might affect me, he might challenge me, he might even cause me terrible destruction, but I will still remain. The sand will still remain. That, I think, is the looking at it all together, based on how the Ramban understands that we should understand this parasha, how Rav Soloveitchik sees this idea of the battle between Yaakov and the Malach as that eternal battle with those who seek to do us harm, and the model of both hope and strength that comes through. The hope that comes through for we take steps, even though we don't know whether it will work, as Ibn Ezra says. He had no idea, and yet he still carried on. And then the strength of faith, the emunah that we have in Hashem, to know that he compares us to the sand. It will wash, but it will never wash away completely. I'd like to share with you now an idea on a completely different topic, which is the story of Dino. The episode of Dino in Shechem, Perek Lamed Daled, Posuk Yud Gimel. It's really the whole. Obviously, the whole of the parsha, that whole section. So, the Yaakov Kamenetsky in Emes Yaakov has a very, very beautiful piece on this, which I think brings us some really new understandings of how to understand this parasha altogether. He begins with a series of questions, effectively why it is that Yaakov hears what has happened. Why is he silent? He hears that his daughter has been violated. Why does he wait until they come? Why did he wait? He should have done something. Should have answered Hamor and Shechem, right? Why did he wait till his sons came? And he asks why it is that it says the Bnei Yaakov and Shechem and Hamor Oviv, they answered with deceit and they said Asher Timei Dina Achusam. Once again, it repeats that he defiled Dinah. Why is that repeated? And of course, you have the end, the classic question, if you like, is that after Shimon and Levi defeat, they kill the men of Shechem. Yaakov gets very angry. You've caused me huge problems. Everyone's going to attack me. And in Pasuk Lamed Aleph, it says that Shimon and Levi answered Yaakov, and they say, "Should our sister become like a harlot?" And famously, Yaakov does not answer there. He doesn't give an answer. Seems to be he agreed. How else do you eat? Well, he doesn't reply. Why doesn't he reply? And clearly, also, he says that Yaakov understood what they were planning. It would be logical for him to understand that when they made this demand on them that they should all have become circumcised, have bris milah, Yaakov understood clearly there must have been some clever plan, some deceit going on here. So why is it that he waited and why did he get so angry at the end? At the end of the day, he would have realized what was going on and why they decided to do what they decided to do. And the main section of what he did, the way he discusses this, he bases it around what he describes as a machshava rishona and a machshava shniya. A person in life, he says, has a straight way of thinking, a first way of thinking. You know, someone says something to you and you have an immediate response. And that's almost like the seichel hayasha, the straightforward way of thinking. You have your common sense answer. And then sometimes you have to fall back on a machshava shniya, right? This plan is not going to work. I've got to go through a second thought process, right? A classic example of when a person has to repeat and go through a second way of thinking, they have to think to themselves, well, the first way I thought I would deal with this situation isn't going to work here, is a case when you see that someone is approaching you with guile, with deceit, with in a way that is very, very difficult to respond to in a normal, straight manner, because they're not dealing with you in that respect. This is what was going on here. Yaakov saw that when they make their offer and they say, we will marry with you, or we'll be friends and everything else, they see that the way they are clearly just trying to fill out. And it is something which he can see there has to be a way of dealing with this in a way that is in an unnatural way. But it's especially unnatural for him. Yaakov is a person who represents truth, represents emes. There's a lot to be said about why it is that he is always challenged in truth there as well. And the whole emes, last week's parasha, why is he challenged in that way? But that's a separate point. But the way Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky understands it is that Yaakov deliberately understands that he can't be the one to give the response and to deal with this guile and deceit in a deceitful way. Therefore, he leaves it to the hands of his sons, because he knows they have to deal with them in a way, as the Pasuk says, you've got to deal with somebody who deals with them in a twisted way, in a way that effectively sorts them out. He knows that to deal with them in a straight manner will lead to perhaps his destruction. So he knows that, or terrible consequences, but he himself can't do it. So he leaves them to do it. If so, why is he so angry? The answer is, says the Rambam, that they went far too far. His idea was, let them find a way of rescuing his daughter from the city, from Dinah, right? Rescuing Dinah, from the city. The idea, he thought, was that they would become weakened through the bris milah, and as a result, they would be able to rescue her, not that they would massacre the city. And that is why he became, according to the Ramban, so angry and so upset with them and the way because they had taken things too far. So says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and just understanding just to understand the parsha. The problem is the end, the response. Should she make our sister like a harlot? We know, as many notice, of course, it's clear, it's explicit in the Psukim that he does answer, but he doesn't answer till the end of his life. He answers in Vayechi. And in Vayechi, he says, Shimon v'Levi Achim Klei Chamos v'Cheresehem. He rebukes them for their the way they acted in a violent way. But then he says, Achal Kain v'Yaakov afitzein b'Yisrael. I will divide them in Yaakov, and I will scatter them amongst the Jewish people. So that part we understand. It seems to be measure for measure, right? Because they acted in concert together to wage war against in an inappropriate way. They massacred the town of Shechem. Therefore, they have to be divided and split and separated. The problem is, if that you look at Rashi in Parshas Vayechi, Perek Mem Tes Posuk Hey, then you find that Rashi brings in from Chazal the idea that it's not simply that they were scattered, that they were separated. Rashi says that that they would have a task to do when they were scattered, right? Rashi says, he says, he says, Al Tichat Kavoidi, and there's a Chalkein B'Yaakov, Posuk Zayin, pregnant test Posuk Zayin, Afrideim Zeh Mizeh, I will separate them one from another, Shelo Yehi Levi B'Minyan Hashvotim, Barim Chalukim. Dova Achi, this is it, Dova Achi, this is another pshat from the Medrash. Ein L'cha Aniyim Sofrim Tamalamdi Tinokas El Mishim. He says that Shimon's task will be to be Sofrim and Malamdi Tinokas, they would teach children. He goes on to say that Levi, Rashi says that Levi would be, they would have to go around collecting for the Trumas and Maishos, but we know that the responsibility of teaching Torah also fell on Levi. They were, right? That's right. That's what it is. Yoram Mishpatach Yaakov. They had to teach Torah. So here you have a fascinating and incredibly surprising thing, right? Who would be the last people you would expect to appoint as teachers? I will scatter them amongst the Jewish people, and I will make them Melamdei Tinokus. They will teach the children. Of all people, of all of the Shvatim, right? The last you would imagine that would be appointed with that incredibly important responsibility of teachers would be Shimon and Levi. What's going on? So it's a fascinating and very important question. So Rabbi Yaakov has a very, very beautiful and profound way of understanding this. He says that when they said those words, with that feeling, that power, our sister become a harlot, and they took the action that they took, even though Yaakov felt it was wrong, completely wrong in that circumstance. They demonstrated that they had an incredible single-mindedness, a dedication, a desire to do the right thing, to right a wrong in the world. That was what they demonstrated. They demonstrated that was at the heart of their characters. It was who they were. And the point, therefore, is that even though the others were there, the other brothers were there, but they didn't act the way, they didn't have that same burning passion within them to do the right thing as Shimon, or as they saw it, right? To rescue her in that sense, right? As Shimon and Levi did. When Yaakov saw that that's what they had within them in their midas, he effectively said to himself, if they channel that correctly, if they can have the correct dedication of Mesiras Nefesh to channel those passions in the right direction, they are the best possible teachers, because they will remain single-minded in their dedication to chinuch, to educating, to teaching Torah. And we know that there are very few other things that a person can do that require the same level of dedication and commitment and feeling as a teacher of children. The Gemara says in Ksubas, the story of Rabbi Chia, who went, saw that there was a problem where there wasn't enough, he described the way in which he would teach, and he went around and he would go and he did put all the stages in himself. He would shecht an animal, and he would flay the skin of the animal. He would create parchment, and he would write on it the Sefer Torah, and he would give it to children. He would tell the children to teach each other. Every step of the way, every part of the process of chinuch required immense dedication, immense commitment, immense self-sacrifice. Yaakov saw that the way Yaakov Kamenetsky describes it is shekinas Hashem boyeres bilvovom. That kinas Hashem, that wanting to make sure that the right thing was done, burned within them. and therefore Yaakov gave them that he gave them that responsibility. But it's not quite the end of it. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky himself, in Emes Yaakov, has a comment as well on the Posuk in Vayechi. And in Vayechi, he says, that was the plan, but it didn't quite work out that way. Because in the end, Shimon and Levi went in different directions in terms of the way they fulfilled this task or didn't, right? Because what you find is that Levi succeeds. Levi becomes the teacher of Torah. Levi is the one who, when the situation demands it, can step forward after the Egel Hazav, right? And Yirmila Shem Elai, they're there with that burning passion in the right circumstances to stand with Moshe Rabbeinu and make sure that the problems of the situation is resolved, is dealt with. But Shimon, unfortunately, is not. Because what happens with Shimon is the entire opposite with Cosby and Zimri, right? So Shimon is the very one who commits, the Nasi of Shimon, the leader of the tribe of Shimon, he's the one who takes the Zonah in public, and that passion comes out in completely the wrong way when it comes to Shimon. What's the difference? Says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, because Levi and Mitzrayim, we know, had the opportunity to learn Torah. That's how they became the teachers. They were excused from the building and the construction and everything else that was and the slavery, the shibud. In other words, having a burning passion, commitment to something is not enough. It has to be channeled, it has to be shaped, it has to be measured. And that can only happen through the guidance of the Torah. So that you have a situation where ultimately the descendant of Levi and the descendant of Shimon come into conflict. Who is the one who takes the spear? Pinchas, right? Because Pinchas has the same midah, the same kinah, the same hachazono ya'aseh sachoseinu. Can this happen? How can this possibly happen? But it's channeled, because Levi has learned how to channel that, and sadly Shimon hasn't. It's an incredible insight into the power of and the foresight of Yaakov Avinu, saying they have this midah, they have this trait, but we can channel it. It can be channeled in the right way. Let me appoint them to the task which needs the greatest commitment and dedication. To be a teacher. There's been a lot in the news today about teachers and how they're managing and in the current situation in the pandemic. The dedication they've made. It's all true. Teaching is an incredibly difficult thing to do, to remain committed to the task, to see it through everything. And he said, I'll let Shimon and Levi do that, but only if it's shaped and channeled can it work properly. And our model for that in the end becomes Levi rather than Shimon. There is no such thing as a bad midah, as something which is a negative character trait per se. Every midah can be used for good or for bad. It all depends how you channel it. And that was what Yaakov hoped would happen as a result in his words of Vayechi to Shimon and Levi. Thank you all for joining. Wish you a good evening. Okay. Thank you for joining us online as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yaakov adds there, he says, the word Oz as well. They wanted them to use that others to channel in the right.
Right.